I always believed that if things ever got truly bad, my family would stand with me. I was wrong. The moment the problem became too big, they didn't look for a solution. They looked for someone to carry it. And that someone was me. I always thought of myself as the calm one in my family. Not because I didn't care, but because I learned not to push back. When there was a problem, I listened. When someone needed help, I showed up. Growing up, I was taught that this was what being reliable looked like. I didn't ask too many questions. I didn't demand explanations. I didn't insist on my own way. And now I understand that this is exactly what made me perfect. At that time, my life felt unusually stable. My job was steady. Nothing exciting, but nothing falling apart either. I rented a small apartment, saved some money, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like things were under control. I didn't see my family often, but we talked almost every week. The conversations were simple, normal, no tension, no warning signs. Everything changed after a phone call from my aunt. Her voice was too calm. Not the kind of calm that comes from comfort, but the kind that feels planned, like she already knew what she was going to say, and in what order. She told me the family needed to get together, soon, about something important. When I asked what was going on, she avoided the question and said something that left a hollow feeling in my chest. This involves you more than you realize. I remember staring at my phone long after the call ended. One thought kept repeating in my head. If this involved me, why hadn't anyone talked to me about it before? What I didn't know then was that a decision had already been made, and my opinion had never been part of it. We met 2 days later. My parents' house looked exactly the same as always. And that was the most unsettling part. The same furniture, the same smell of coffee, the same quiet that once made me feel safe. Everyone was already there. My parents, my aunt, my cousin. They smiled, but none of those smiles reached their eyes. It felt like everyone knew something I didn't. At first, we talked about nothing. Weather, work, small, pointless details. I had the strange sense that they were dragging it out on purpose. Finally, my father cleared his throat and said the situation was serious. He spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully. It involved money, documents, a problem that had grown too big to ignore. I didn't understand how any of this connected to me. Then they placed a folder on the table. Thick, neatly organized. I noticed my last name immediately. My stomach dropped. I opened it and saw papers I had never seen before. Signatures, dates, commitments. Everything looked official and disturbingly correct. I looked up and asked what it was. The answers came almost together. It's temporary. It had to be done. You can handle it. I said I hadn't signed any of this. The room went quiet. Then my mother spoke softly. We thought you would understand. That was the moment I realized this conversation wasn't really about a problem. It was about me. I kept rereading the papers, hoping I was missing something, but the longer I looked, the clearer it became. This had been planned for a long time. The decisions weren't made yesterday, or even last week. Based on the dates, my family had been discussing this for months, while I went on with my life, unaware that my name was already being used. That feeling was deeply unsettling. Like I had been quietly removed from the room while my future was decided without me. I tried to stay calm. I asked who exactly decided this should be put under my name. My father looked at my mother. My mother looked at my aunt. No one rushed to answer. Finally, my aunt said there was no other option, that things had gone too far, that if the documents were tied to someone else, the consequences would be worse. Then she said it almost with relief. You're stronger than the rest of us. What shocked me was how confident they sounded, as if my ability to handle this was a given. I said it wasn't fair, that no one even asked me. My mother sighed and said that if they had asked, I would have said no. There was irritation in her voice, as if my possible refusal was just another obstacle they needed to get around. That was when I realized something. To them, I wasn't a son or a nephew. I was a solution. I set the folder aside and felt a heavy wave of anger mixed with confusion rise inside me. I wanted to stand up and leave. but my body felt frozen. I asked what would happen next. Who would be responsible if things went wrong? The answer came too quickly. My father said that formally it would be me. The word formally was spoken as if it was supposed to make everything easier. I started asking specific questions. What would happen to my job, my savings, my reputation? Their answers were vague. They said we would figure it out as we go, that family wouldn't abandon me, that it was temporary. The same words were repeated over and over, losing meaning each time. No one had a real plan, except for one thing. Everything would be tied to my name. When I said I didn't agree, the mood shifted. Voices became colder. My aunt pointed out that if I refused, the consequences could affect everyone. My mother said I was putting the family at risk. My father stayed quiet, but his look was heavy, full of judgment. I realized this was no longer a discussion. It was pressure. Something broke inside me then. I understood that they were not considering a no from me. That option simply did not exist. The conversation dragged on. The clock on the wall kept ticking, and for some reason that sound irritated me more than anything else. I felt cornered, but a part of me still hoped someone would say this was a mistake, that they would stop. Instead, my father started talking about duty, about how family isn't just support but responsibility. He looked at me like I had already failed them, even though I hadn't done anything yet. I reminded them that I had my own life, my own plans, that if things went wrong, I would be the one living with the consequences. My mother said I was being dramatic, that in the worst case, I would just have to endure it for a while. The phrase "for a while" felt especially cruel, like she was talking about a minor inconvenience, not years of possible fallout. My aunt added that I had always been the most reasonable one, the most reliable. She said it gently, but I heard calculation in her voice. My personality, my strengths, everything I once took pride in, was now being used against me. I realized that was exactly why they chose me, and not someone else. I asked what would happen if I refused completely. The answer wasn't direct, but it was clear. We wouldn't survive that. That was the moment I understood. My sacrifice had already been built into their plan. Silence settled over the room after those words. It felt heavy and suffocating, like everyone was waiting for me to break first. I could feel their eyes on me, but no one spoke. That silence was the hardest part. There was no doubt in it, no hesitation, just the quiet expectation that I would agree. I tried to imagine what would happen if I said yes, how I would explain it to myself, how I would wake up every day knowing I was living with the consequences of someone else's decision. The thought made me feel physically sick. But almost immediately, another image followed. What would happen if I said no? Coldness, resentment, broken relationships. I realized they had already accepted that possibility and were prepared to blame me either way. I said I needed time. My father frowned. My mother looked worried, but her concern seemed more about the situation than about me. My aunt nodded, then quickly added that there wasn't much time, that everything could fall apart if I delayed. Her words sounded like a quiet threat. When I left the house, no one offered to walk me out. I closed the door behind me and realized that for the first time in my life, I felt like a stranger in a place I once called home. And that feeling stayed with me. I barely slept that night. I lay in the dark, replaying the conversation over and over, as if I might find something I had missed. Each of their arguments sounded colder now. They never asked if I could handle it. They assumed I had to. That thought hurt the most. I realized that my personal boundaries had never been real to them. In the morning, messages started coming in. First from my mother. Short and careful. She said she was worried and that the family was under a lot of stress. Then my father wrote. His message was brief and dry. He reminded me about the deadlines and asked me to approach the situation responsibly. My aunt joined in later with a long message about how important it was to stay united and not destroy what had been built over the years. Not a single message asked how I was feeling. I noticed my own tone changing as I replied. I started explaining myself, justifying my hesitation, as if I had already done something wrong. That realization scared me. The pressure was working. slowly but effectively. They didn't need to yell or threaten me directly. At some point, I placed my phone face down. I understood that if I kept responding, I would be pulled back into their logic. And I was no longer sure I wanted to be part of it. The next day, I decided to visit my grandmother. It was spontaneous, but I needed to see someone who wasn't directly involved in the pressure. She lived alone in an old house that had always felt like a place of calm. When she opened the door, her eyes rested on me a little longer than usual, as if she knew something was wrong. We sat in the kitchen drinking tea, and at first I talked about nothing important. Work, the weather, how long it had been since I last visited. She listened without interrupting. Then she said almost casually that the family was having old conversations again. I froze. I hadn't asked what she meant. She continued on her own. She said she had heard that I was once again at the center of a decision, that people were asking for my help. The word sounded false. I asked how she knew. She shrugged and said these things always reached her, even when no one wanted to speak openly. Then she said something that made my chest tighten. She told me that a similar situation had happened a long time ago, and back then, the most convenient option had been chosen as well. I asked who she meant. She looked at me for a long moment and quietly said that it had been my father, and that he was still paying the price for that decision. I asked my grandmother to explain more, but she immediately became tense. She said she wasn't sure she had the right to talk about it, that some things in our family had always been kept quiet, not out of cruelty, but out of fear. I told her I could already feel that fear pressing on me, and that I couldn't live without understanding what was happening. She slowly nodded. She told me that many years ago, my father had been placed in a situation where a sacrifice was expected for the sake of family peace. He was told it would be temporary, that everyone would be better off if he agreed. They convinced him it was the right thing to do, and that the family would stand by him. But after he made that choice, he was slowly pushed aside. His opinion stopped mattering. His voice became inconvenient. I asked if my mother had known. My grandmother didn't answer right away. Then she said yes, and that my mother had been the one who helped convince him it was for the best. My breathing grew heavy. All the pieces suddenly fit together into a picture I didn't want to see. She said the same story was repeating itself now. The roles had just shifted slightly, and if I agreed, in a few years my own yes would be used against me. When I was leaving, she took my hand and told me not to trust words alone, not even from the people I loved the most. After my conversation with my grandmother, I spent days walking through a mental fog. I looked at my parents and saw different people. Their words sounded different now. The pauses between sentences felt calculated. Even their concerns seemed rehearsed. I caught myself analyzing every glance, every movement, searching for proof that I was being prepared for something I never agreed to. One evening, my father came into my room. He sat on the edge of the bed and stayed silent for a long time. Then he said he knew I was struggling, that he had once felt cornered too. His voice cracked, but he quickly regained control. He said that sometimes you have to make decisions not for yourself. I asked if he regretted it. He didn't answer. He only asked me not to make things harder. That was when I understood something terrifying. He wasn't protecting me. He was training me. He wasn't speaking as a father, but as someone who had already gone through this and was now passing it forward. When he left, I sat in the silence, realizing there was no real choice, only the appearance of one. That was the moment something inside me broke. I stopped hoping this was a misunderstanding. This was a plan, long-term, careful, a family tradition. After that conversation, my father started asking me to talk more often. It always looked casual, like he was just passing by. But every conversation moved in the same direction. He spoke about stability, about family as a system, about how personal desires are sometimes a luxury you can't afford. He never named anything directly, but I felt myself being guided toward a conclusion he had already chosen. My mother took a different approach. She became softer, more caring. She cooked my favorite meals, asked how I was feeling, sometimes just sat beside me in silence. But that silence carried pressure. She kept saying she trusted me, that I was mature enough to understand. The words sounded like praise, but they were a trap. Refusing meant I was still a child. Agreeing meant I had joined their world. The worst part was that I started doubting myself. I caught moments where I thought, maybe they're right. Maybe I'm selfish. Those thoughts appeared on their own, like they had been planted long ago. I got angry at myself for being weak, but I couldn't stop the internal argument. That's when I realized they weren't forcing me openly. They were breaking me from the inside, and they were doing it carefully. The turning point came without warning. I found it by accident while looking for old documents for college. In the bottom drawer of my father's desk, there was an unlabeled folder. Inside were copies of contracts, notarized papers, and letters dated years back. My name appeared far too often. I knew immediately this wasn't random. The more I read, the colder I felt. The documents discussed property, obligations, and conditions that would activate after reaching a specific age. My age. It looked like my life had been part of a deal for a long time. I didn't understand every legal detail, but one thing was clear. I was being positioned as a tool. When I heard footsteps in the hallway, my heart slammed so hard I thought the sound would expose me. I put the folder back quickly and walked out, pretending nothing had happened. But inside, a countdown had started. Now I had proof, and I couldn't pretend I was ignorant anymore. That night, I barely slept. I replayed every sentence my parents had said over the years, and watched it all fall perfectly into place. This wasn't pressure, this was control. From that point on, I started living a double life. On the surface, I stayed the same son who listened, nodded, and asked no extra questions. Inside, I was watching everything. I noticed details I had ignored before. Phone calls that ended the moment I walked in, meetings I was never told about, names spoken in the house belonging to people I had never met. I checked the dates on the documents. Some decisions had been made back when I was in middle school. That meant my plans, my dreams, even my college choices had never mattered. It was all set dressing, designed to keep me cooperative. Realizing this didn't make me angry. It left me with a heavy, crushing emptiness. One night at dinner, my mother casually mentioned the future, using the phrase, "when everything is finalized." She smiled and changed the subject, but I had heard enough. They were confident I knew nothing. That confidence made them calm, and that calm scared me the most. I understood that if I asked a direct question now, they would deny everything. They would call me paranoid. They were good at that. I had seen it before, so the conversation had to be different, and the timing had to be mine. I started preparing for the conversation like it was an exam. I wrote down phrases they had used for years. I noted when my mother applied pressure through guilt, and when my father relied on logic. I knew that if I hesitated, the discussion would turn into fog again, and I would start doubting my own memory. I needed facts and control. At least on the surface, the opportunity came on its own. At breakfast, my father said that people would be visiting that day. Evening, and asked me to be home. He said it too casually, too normal. I nodded, but something tightened inside me. I knew this wasn't random. This was a step, maybe the final one. That evening, the house felt unnaturally quiet. Even the clock on the wall sounded loud. When the doorbell rang, my mother straightened, as if preparing for a performance. Two people walked into the living room. A man and a woman, confident, calm. They looked at me like they already knew me. My father introduced them as family partners. In that moment, I understood something clearly. The conversation had started without my consent, and if I stayed silent now, I would be agreeing to everything they planned. They sat down like it was a business meeting. The man placed a folder on the table. The woman folded her hands and studied me closely. No one asked if I was comfortable. No one explained why they were there. My father spoke first. His voice was calm and confident, like he was reading from a prepared script. He said it was time to be honest, that everything had been done for the greater good. I interrupted him. For the first time, silence filled the room. I asked why my name was on documents I had never been told about. My mother gasped, like she had been struck. My father looked at me as if I had broken an unspoken rule. He said I was never meant to see those papers. He didn't deny it. He didn't defend himself. He just stated it. The woman smiled gently and said these kinds of arrangements were common in families with assets. She spoke calmly, almost kindly, like she was explaining something complicated to a child. They called me part of the structure, a safeguard, a connecting element, never a person. That's when I realized everything had already been decided. They weren't asking me anything. They were informing me. The room went painfully quiet. I could feel all of their eyes on me, fixed and heavy, but no one rushed to speak. They were not waiting for my approval. They were waiting for compliance. I asked directly what would happen if I refused. The man in the suit tilted his head slightly and said that the chain of obligations would break. He said it calmly, like he was talking about a shelf, not my life. My mother started speaking faster than usual. She insisted it was just a formality, that there was almost no real risk. My father stayed silent. His silence carried more weight than any argument. I realized he had already gone through this stage. The resistance, the questions, and then acceptance. They expected the same from me. I said I needed a legal explanation. The woman smiled, but there was irritation in her eyes. She said all the details had already been discussed many times. Just not with me. Never with me. And in that moment I understood one thing clearly. If I stayed quiet now, it would be no way back. I asked for copies of the documents. Not tomorrow, not later. Right now. There was a pause in the room, short but telling. The man looked at my father. The woman looked at my mother. That exchange said more than words ever could. My father nodded slowly, like he was granting permission, and the folder was pushed toward me again. I started reading out loud, not on purpose. It was the only way to keep myself steady. Clauses, obligations, language without a single human word in it. Everything revolved around my responsibility and someone else's abstract benefit. I asked why there were no guarantees for me anywhere. The woman said, calmly, that family is the guarantee. I laughed, sharp and brief. It sounded wrong in the room, almost rude, but I could not stop it. I said they were already using me like a tool. My mother snapped. She accused me of being ungrateful. My father finally spoke and said I was going too far, but his voice shook. That was when I knew the truth was already out, and now they were trying to force it back down. The woman closed the folder carefully, like the conversation had gone too far. She said emotions would not help and suggested we return to the facts. According to her, the facts were simple. The documents were almost finalized. The processes were already in motion. A refusal on my part would create serious consequences. Not for me, for everyone. That wording was deliberate. I asked what kind of consequences. The man answered vaguely. Reputational risks, financial complications, questions from the wrong people. My mother looked at me like I was already doing something terrible. My father sat with his hands clenched, eyes down. I said what scared me was not the situation itself, but how easily they were pushing me into it. The room went quiet again. The woman stood up and said that was enough for today. But as she left, she added that time was not on my side. That was when I understood. This was not a meeting. It was a warning. After they left, the house felt empty, not physically, emotionally. My mother started clearing the table, too fast, too loud. My father disappeared into another room without a word. I stayed where I was, feeling a strange sense of calm. The fear was still there, but something new sat on top of it. Clarity. I realized they already saw my refusal as temporary, a mistake I would soon fix. I could see it in how they acted. My mother spoke to me more softly, like I was sick. My father avoided conversations, like he was giving me time to mature. That confidence made me angrier than any threat. I started checking my records, credit history, registrations, anything tied to my name. And every day I found more small irregularities, inquiries I never made, papers I had never seen. The picture formed slowly, but perfectly. They were not just preparing me. They were already using me. I could no longer pretend I was living a normal life. At work, I caught myself not hearing my coworkers. At home, there was constant tension, like the walls were listening. One night, I sat at my computer and started looking for legal help. Anonymously. Carefully. I did not even trust the search bar. A few days later, I met with a lawyer. He spoke little and asked precise questions, When I showed him the documents, he stayed silent for a long time. Then he said the situation was more complicated than I realized. Some obligations were already active, in my name, without my consent. I asked if it could be stopped. He answered honestly, yes, but it would mean open conflict, court, severed ties, and the complete destruction of the family illusion I had grown up with. His words did not scare me. They confirmed what I already knew. On the way home, I understood there was no choice left. It had been made for me long ago. Now there was only one question. Would I allow it to continue? I decided not to say anything to my family. Not yet. I needed to see how far they would go, thinking I was still hesitating. I became convenient again. Polite, calm. I asked neutral questions and did not argue. Almost immediately, I noticed changes. Phone calls got longer. Whispers appeared more often in the house. They felt the process was moving forward. One day, my mother mentioned that I would soon need to sign a few more formalities. She said it casually, like she was talking about a utility bill. I nodded. Inside, everything tightened. I knew the next step would be final. After that, there would be no way back. I met with the lawyer again. We built a plan. It was harsh and uncomfortable, but it was the only option. It involved notices, freezes, and a formal request. Everything had to happen fast, in one day, without warning. That night, I sat in my room listening to my parents talk in the kitchen. They sounded calm, almost relieved. And in that moment, I knew one thing for certain. Tomorrow, I would become their enemy. Everything happened at once that morning. Account freezes, official letters, legal notices. I knew they would see it almost immediately. I was not home when the calls started. First from my mother, then from my father. I watched the screen and did not answer. When I came back that evening, the house felt different. Not angry, empty. My mother sat at the table with red eyes. My father stood by the window, hunched, like he had aged 10 years in a day. They asked what I had done. I answered calmly. I protected myself. My mother screamed that I had destroyed the family, that I betrayed them. I said a family is not built on secret contracts. My father looked at me without confidence for the first time. There was fear in his eyes, the same fear I had seen in my grandmother. In that moment, I understood something clearly. Their control over me was over, but the cost was permanent. The consequences came fast. Relatives stopped calling. Some sent short messages filled with blame and disappointment. No one asked why I did it. They did not need an answer. They needed someone to carry the fault. And now, that person was me. The lawyer warned me the process would be long. Possible court battles, pressure, attempts to negotiate. But the hardest part was already behind me. I was no longer living inside an illusion. I no longer waited for protection from people who never planned to give it. A few weeks later, I moved out. Quietly, no goodbyes. I left the house I grew up in and realized I felt no regret, only exhaustion, and a strange sense of relief. Sometimes I think about who I would have become if I had agreed. That thought scares me more than anything. Because now I know the truth. They did not choose me by accident, and I did the only thing I could to make it stop. The final conversation came without warning. My father called me, not with accusations, not with pressure. His voice sounded tired and unfamiliar. He asked to meet. No lawyers, no documents, just to talk. I agreed, even though I knew it could be another attempt to regain control. We met at a small cafe on the edge of town. He looked older than I remembered. He sat across from me and stayed silent for a long time. Then he said they never thought I would go this far. Those words hurt the most. Not regret, not guilt. Surprise, like I had broken the script. I asked if he knew from the beginning. He nodded, said he believed there was no other way. That the family mattered more than one person. I told him that was exactly how families break. He looked at me, and for the first time, had no response. Before leaving, he said the door to the house was still open for me. I understood it was not true. It was only open under one condition, and I had already made my choice. Time passed. The processes continued, but my life slowly began to rebuild. Carefully, quietly. I stopped waiting for calls. I stopped checking messages. The silence became familiar. Sometimes painful, but honest. I realized the hardest part was not the betrayal itself. It was understanding how early they prepared me for it. How love was replaced with obligation. How calm was treated as weakness. Those things do not disappear overnight. They stay inside you, and you learn to live with them. Sometimes I dream about that house, the same kitchen, the same table, but I am no longer sitting at it. I am standing by the door. And I feel no desire to go back in. When I wake up, I understand that this is the ending. Not loud, not dramatic, just final. They chose me to carry the consequences. I chose myself to make it stop. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel, give it a like. And click on the bell so you don't miss any more stories. See you soon.